Welcome to the Dialogue by Wirepoints, connecting the dots between our economy, government, and people. And now your hosts, Ted Dabrowski and Mark Glennon.
Hello, this is Ted Dabrowski, and I'm with my partner from Wirepoints, Mark Glennon. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the new budget that Governor Pritzker has proposed for 2023. And, it's getting a lot of attention for, several things. One of them is that Governor Pritzker is seemingly taking credit for how much, and I put these between quotes, how much better the numbers are in Illinois right now. But the other part is his proposed breaks or relief that he wants to offer Illinoisans as part of this budget. So Mark is going to help me break this down for all of you, and don't be surprised that we're not happy about the whole thing. And let's get right into it. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the big things you saw, or maybe just start with some of let's call them good things, so that we can get those out of the way, because they might be good, they might not be good, but certainly they warrant some discussion.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about these, Ted, but you tell me if you agree. I say there were three things in the speech that I thought were good. First, he said the state would cover the hole in the college Illinois savings plan. That's a horrible plan that the state itself sponsored. That's deeply underwater, basically a fraud, in my opinion, perpetrated by the state. And the state had a moral obligation to fix it. So I had no problem with putting money into that. Secondly, he did set aside money for the rainy day fund, which is not a large amount. I think it was several hundred million, not a lot in the big picture, but that's a prudent thing to set aside. We have basically zero reserves at this point. Finally, the speech, setting aside the substance of the speech, it was, as usual, a very nice speech, nicely written. I'd like to know who writes his speeches. Started out with a nice emotional thing about with some quotes from Margaret Mead, nicely delivered, as is always the case with Pritzker. He's very smooth. But that's, in fact, what makes him dangerous. If he were a stumble bum, it would be easier, perhaps, for the public to see through some of the things that he said. So we'll turn to the substance now. And Ted, you wrote the first piece, focusing in great detail on just that issue that you said. He said what I believe to be one of the greatest whoppers in his career, which is saying something. He said expressly that, let's be clear, this improvement in our budget, and he's claiming a $1.7 billion surplus, is not due to federal aid, all the recent pandemic relief. Ted, what did your research establish in great detail?
Yeah, so let me say just a little bit of what he said, right? It's a $45 billion spending plan. It's the biggest budget we've ever had. And you have to consider that that's happening on the heels of what, has been the biggest economic shock since way back when, since a recession, really. And so we got the biggest spend. And what Pritzker said is that, Illinois has received 2 credit upgrades, the first in 20 years. And that is true. We've had just series of downgrades. We had 13 downgrades under Governor Quinn. We had 8 more downgrades under Rauner, and we had 1 under Pritzker right when he started. So basically, we finally managed to get some upgrades. And so he celebrated that. And then he also touted the fact that the state has paid down the unpaid bills backlog that has been a perennial problem for us. And then, as you mentioned, he celebrated this budget surplus. So there's a whole bunch of things he celebrated. The problem is that he's basically trying to take credit for all of this that's happened in Illinois, when in fact, if you try to analyze anything he's done in the last 2 years, you can't find any reforms, any real things to improve Illinois and make it grow and make its revenues grow. The one thing that they did was they hiked taxes on businesses by $650 million a year ago. So that's the only revenue generating thing they did. So the real thing, the real thanks then, if they didn't do anything, is this nearly $200 billion in federal COVID money that has come in. You're talking about, massive amounts of money coming into the public sector, the private sector. Let me just reel off a few. $70 billion came in loan and grant programs to small businesses. Airline industry got 18 billion. Imagine that. You've got this income support of these unemployment benefits, child and family services. That's almost 30 billion. The state and local governments got 30 billion. The direct stimulus checks that people got was another 30 billion. These are just massive numbers compared to the size of our economy. So what all that did was it just super pumped up, people's spending. So sales tax revenues for the state are much higher. It pumped up income tax revenues for the state because people had actually more money during this crisis than less. It pumped up capital gains taxes because we've seen this massive, shoot up in the stock market, not the last few weeks, but before that. So you've had capital gains, and also just inflation, right? So the higher inflation goes, the higher your tax revenues go up. So it's been a fantastic spin, and it's given Governor Pritzker and the State House so much money that they're just trying to figure out how to spend it. Now we have to remember this is only going to last for a couple of years, and then it's done, it's gone. But it's a party time for now, and Pritzker is trying to make himself look good when in fact he should have been a little bit more humble and said a few other things instead.
Yeah, Ted, it's that second category that most people are overlooking. The state itself directly got about $8 billion, maybe more, maybe up to 15 if you count some pass-throughs that they gave to the municipalities and such. That alone would be more than enough to account for the supposed surplus that he's claiming. But the extraordinary increase in tax revenue that we've achieved is what's being overlooked. And that unquestionably comes because of this just astonishingly irresponsible, in my view, $10 trillion national pandemic relief plan in various different pieces of legislation that has goosed the economy and goosed the tax revenues in so many different ways.
Sorry, Mark, I want to make sure that you said 10 trillion. Is that right?
That's right, with a T. $10 trillion have been doled out. And let's stop here, Ted. I want to really give a big shout out to you and John. In February of last year, when Congress was debating the most recent plan, the American Rescue Plan, which gave another $190 billion to states and municipalities, you wrote a piece thoroughly documenting why the states did not need this. It was ignored, of course. That plan went through. You have turned out to be entirely correct. All across the country, states are rolling in money. There's any number of articles published nationally with governors and other states giving their State of the State speeches, national analysts pointing to this. It wasn't needed. This is in excess. It's like manna from heaven for them that came out of nowhere. Of course, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the Treasury, which means we're going to have to pay it back through federal taxes and through money created by the Federal Reserve Board, which has caused this inflation rate that we now have running at over 7% per year. It's, in my view, the most fiscally irresponsible year we've had in American history. And a lot of Republicans, by the way, in Congress voted, at least for the initial package. It was appropriate initially to flood the system with money when the pandemic first appeared and we didn't know how severe it was going to be. But by February, at least, of 2021, we had a handle on what the numbers now were, and it did not justify the kind of spending that the federal government did.
I mean, you're right, Mark. By then, the CARES Act had already sent a lot of money to states. A lot of states, not Illinois, but a lot of states had massive, and I shouldn't say massive. They had a lot of reserves. A lot of them were well prepared. So when you look at the CARES Act money that went to states, and then you took in the account the reserves they had, virtually all the states were prepared except for a handful. And so we certainly didn't need that, and it's proving itself out. And I want you to talk a little bit more about some of the states in a minute I think you're having a piece that's going to come out just showing how much money there is out there. But it was clearly not needed. And so, what's interesting about this whole thing is that I think you earlier just mentioned Pritzker's quote saying that, he said, "Let me set the record straight for you. Our state budget surpluses would exist even without the money we received from the federal government." That's what he said in his speech this week. Well, that's a massive contradiction to what he was saying, a year ago. He said on WBZ Chicago, he said, "There's no chance we won't have to suffer severe, damaging cuts to higher education, to K through 12 education, to basic services that people need if we don't get any support. That's what's going to happen to our state," the governor said. "We're going to see just an enormous hole where we've made so much progress." So he really wanted the money, and his administration was asking for it. He was pushing for it. And now, of course, he's forgotten all that, and he's reveling in the cash flow.
The distinguishing feature of his political career is dishonesty. Ted, we have a peace plan where we're going to collect all his whoppers. It's no small project, so it won't be coming up for a while, but we will get it done, and it's a long list. He has no shame whatsoever in telling the public any kind of crazy thing he wants to fit his narrative, partially because he knows he won't be challenged by the Illinois press.
That's true. That's so true.
Partially because they don't have the resources to bird dog him properly, and partially because of bias or incompetence or whatever. He just does not get challenged on these things. And when he is asked a good question, he skips over it and ignores it. There's never any follow-up.
That's precisely right. I think during this speech or after the speech, he should be asked many of the things that we've pointed out in this document. We can't forget, wire points when Don Harmon, Senate President Don Harmon, asked for $42 billion in aid right off the bat when this COVID crisis hit. And, that request triggered a New York Times headline that said this: "Illinois seeks a bailout from Congress for pensions in cities." Governor Pritzker might try to distance himself from that, but that's Illinois. We know how it works. We know that they're connected. Illinois was the only state in the country. So the Federal Reserve created this thing called the Federal Reserve Municipal Liquidity Facility, a fancy name for, hey, if you're in trouble, you can come to the Fed. Illinois was the only state in the country to tap that facility. No other state needed it. But in our situation, it was so bad that we tapped it twice. Again, something that Governor Pritzker's forgotten. And he was able to repay that because of all the new money that came in through the ARP. So again, it's sad. It's sad that he can't, I think, do what the right thing was to be thankful, if you want to call it that, to the federal government for bailing out the state. And a lot of states have been thankful. Is that right, Mark?
That's right. And but first, by the way, Ted, that's one of the things he bragged about, that they paid back that loan early. He and Comptroller Mendoza are bragging about that all the time, never mentioning that we were the only ones that had to do it. But yeah, I spent a lot of time going through what other governors are saying in other states, and they're all, openly acknowledging that they've got a one-time spigot of money from the federal government. Republican and Democratic governors alike, including Governor Newsom in California, who was magnanimous enough to thank the White House, his allies in Congress, for all the money that they've received. They've got now a $45 billion surplus in California, enough to send a check for some $1,100 to every person in California. He at least acknowledged where the money came from, but in Pritzker's case, it's me, I did it. It's just insane.
Yeah, Mark, so, we don't want to always be only, rhetoric in our critique of the governor's plan. So we actually, looked at the numbers as well, because we like to back up everything we say with data. And what was fascinating is John and I went through some of this data. We looked at his, so the budget he just came out with is the proposed budget for 2023, which would start in, it starts in the middle. Our fiscal year in Illinois starts in July 1st. So it's July 1st, 2022 through July 1st or through June 30th, 2023. So this new budget has projected almost $46 billion in revenues, okay? $46 billion in resources that they think they're going to get. Well, just 14 months ago, when he was complaining and worried sick about what's going to happen in Illinois, his forecast was less than 40 billion. So let me make that clear. 46 billion is what he says his budget is now. 14 months ago, he said we're only going to have $40 billion. So in a matter of 14 months, without the legislature ever meeting, frankly, hardly meeting, and they didn't pass any laws of any consequence, they've made up $6 billion in money. And he wants to take credit for that. And that's kind of what's sad, because, it was the difference between 14 months ago. That was before, Biden, this before we knew that Biden was going to win, before the ARP was becoming a reality. And, after that thing passed, Illinois is awash in cash. And if you look at the other numbers we have in there, sorry to get a little wonky here, but before COVID, or I should say, compared to pre-COVID numbers, we have $8 billion more in tax revenues for the state. That's despite the lockdowns, despite the recession, all that. We have $8 billion more. It didn't come at all from anything Pritzker did or the lawmakers and the General Assembly. It's all based on the American Rescue Plan.
Yeah, one way of looking at the proof on that is simply to ask, what reforms did he make that would cause him to think that he gets credit for this? None. There have been no structural reforms of any kind. Nothing material on spending, certainly not on pensions, only tax increases. So he just simply has no basis for his claims. Ted, it's important to point out, too, that in a speech he claimed a surplus of $1.7 billion. We and others have no idea where he's getting that number. We've gone through the actual budget proposal, very long, detailed document. You can look at it. We'll put the link up with this. Look on page 60. That's the summary where it shows surpluses and deficits for the last couple years and the forward projection. There's nothing about $1.7 billion. It claims a much smaller amount. And of course, that's all using phony government accounting, and we can't repeat this warning often enough. The way the government does budgets, they count borrowed money as income. Or if they sell an asset, which really doesn't improve the state's position at all, like if they sell the Thompson Center, they're just swapping that asset for cash at market value. They count that as income. So there's just no, there's other articles up about this too. Illinois Policy has a nice article up about it. Others have been tweeting about it. We just can't find the numbers, and there's been no explanation. Pritzker hasn't been challenged of it, and he'll probably get away with it.
That's right. And I want to just reiterate a point you made about they haven't done anything to make the numbers better. As a matter of fact, we've in our piece that we put out, which you can find at wirepoints.org, we made a small bullet list of some of the things that have made things worse. So one of the things they've done is they've restored salary spiking for teachers so they can get 6% hikes at the end of their careers, automatic spiking. Expanded Medicaid coverage for illegal immigrants. They've made Tier 2 benefits higher for public safety workers. They are using more taxpayer dollars to pick winners and losers in the EV industry. They're giving the Chicago Teacher Union more bargaining powers. They've granted more sick leave benefits to teachers. So these are all increases that the states and taxpayers are going to have to pay. None of that helped raise revenues. It made costs more, made them bigger.
Yeah, and Ted, let's go back to what's happening in other states just to compare and contrast. The Urban Institute did a study of this. Revenues on average across the country for states are up 20% over 2019, the last pre-pandemic year. So there's been a windfall across the board. So you have comments like this coming from various officials around the country. A city manager in California said the ultimate effect of the pandemic was a net positive Isn't it unbelievable, he asked? It's just crazy to think about that. In New York, former Governor David Patterson said, I wish I could close my eyes and wake up and be back in the governor's mansion and be Kathy Hochul, the current governor. So around the country, people have an entirely different view of reality than what Pritzker is claiming about his prowess in conquering our fiscal situation. They know what's going on. And by the way, they've been, for the most part, pretty prudent. There's been heavy debates going on about how to spend this money. They're cognizant that they can't use it to cover up any current spending, that they have to use it as a one-time source to make an investment of some kind. The governor of Vermont had a particularly good State of the State address, which you can find online, which he made that point expressly. And all throughout his speech, he said, remembering that this is temporary money we have, here's where I think it should be spent. No such sense of reality in Illinois.
Mark, let's talk a little bit about pensions too. He didn't come out and take a big. He didn't celebrate the fact that the pension debts are a little bit lower this year. He did say that we're going to put more money into pensions, about $500 million, 200 one year and 300 million another. And there could be a debate about whether that's good or bad. Obviously, the debts are so big that that's a trivial amount, and you'll hear us call for pension reforms. That's the real thing, not just throwing more money into a broken system. But one of the things that I know some of them have celebrated is this fact that the pension liabilities have gone from 144 billion. These are the official numbers, from 144 billion to down to 130 billion. But it's important to point out that, and I think the credit rating agencies were happy too. But this is a once in a lifetime event, or once in a generation event, where the stock market, with all those trillions that you talked about, went so high that returns in the stock market were about 25% for pensions. That's once, like Pew said, it's a once in a generation jump. And so any of that benefit, let's just call it a windfall from the trillions, and God knows if it can be repeated, or even worse, if the stock market really corrects, will it unwind a lot of this benefit? So, more to look out there. But, they haven't touched pensions. They won't talk about them. As a matter of fact, Pritzker said he's going to defend the heck out of them. He's not going to reform them. So that's bad news for anybody.
Another big item that was entirely ignored in the budget address is this huge problem we have with the unemployment trust fund in Illinois. That's what pays out unemployment benefits during the pandemic and at any time. The federal government requires that a certain balance be kept in that account to cover projected liabilities. That balance was about $1 billion, a little over $1 billion before the pandemic. That got wiped out during the pandemic, and Illinois had to go to the federal government to borrow a little over $4 billion for that. So as things stand today, Illinois is facing a hole that has to be corrected of over $5 billion when you add up those two things. And that loan from the federal government is bearing interest, running at about $100 million a year. Well, how did Pritzker deal with it? It's not in the budget. It just entirely ignored it. It has to be made up. It will come automatically by imposing higher taxes on employers or cutting benefits to people who are laid off or lose their job. That amount is so extreme that that's only a theoretical possibility. That won't work. So the state is going to have to cover that out of its budget somehow. No word on how they're going to do that. And again, it's not reflected in any budget projections. The prudent thing to do is to use some of that federal aid money that's still out there to pay that down. That's what most other states have done. A lot of states did have to borrow during the pandemic to protect their unemployment trust funds, but almost all of them have paid back those loans now and have followed the advice given by most fiscal analysts that that's the prudent thing to do. But it's just astonishing to me that he can ignore that topic and leave it out of the budget entirely. He did that last year too, as well, and of course he got away with it.
Well, let me be a skeptic. He could take I think there's 3.6 billion or something like that of the federal direct aid that's unspent. My guess would be he'd rather use it for programs that are more sexy, that get him potentially more votes, rather than putting it into a boring unemployment insurance fund. Mark, also it's more than that, right? Because remind me, the comptroller Mendoza, she's been asking to delay the interest payment. He's asking the federal government to delay interest payments on that. And also there's rumors that they're looking for more federal money to pay for this insurance fund rather than use the current money.
Right. Comptroller Mendoza, along with a few other fiscal officials from the other states that do still have loan balances outstanding, wrote a letter to the treasurer saying, please don't assess us interest on this loan for another year. Give us time to address this. That's effectively asking for more bailout money because that interest would accrue to the benefit, of course, of federal taxpayers. So you're asking the federal taxpayers to be responsible for a freebie loan to those states, mostly blue states, of course, troubled blue states that aren't managing their affairs properly. That request has not been acted upon yet. Of course, there is movement in Congress with Build Back Better and everything else to try to push more money at states. Who knows whether anything will materialize that accomplishes that. But as it stands right now, the problem is simply unaddressed.
Yeah. I want to mention upgrades, the credit upgrades.
Yep.
It's kind of hard to say that's not good news because, I'm talking about Moody's right now. Fitch still has Illinois at one notch above junk, but Moody's is the one we follow the most. We think they've been the most realistic about the pension problem. So as I mentioned, Governor Pritzker celebrated the two upgrades, one from Moody's and one from S&P, and that got Illinois off the brink of a junk rating. And before COVID, before all this money flowed in, there was a big risk that Illinois would have been a junk rated state by now. But anyway, so Pritzker celebrated that, and that is good news. You don't want to be a junk rated state, right? No state has ever been rated junk. But the real issue though is that while he's celebrating, we can't forget something. We're still the worst rated state in the country. We're 2 notches above junk for S&P and Moody's and 1 notch above junk for Fitch. So it's still not something to celebrate. And there's really nothing that's being done to change the trajectory of the state other than this federal money. As we talked, there's no reforms, no property tax reform, no pension reform, no collective bargaining reforms. And don't forget, Chicago is junk rated by Moody's. Chicago Public Schools is deep into a junk rating, along with the same level as Detroit and Detroit Public Schools. So things aren't good. So you can celebrate it, but the more honest assessment would be we're still just 2 notches away from junk. There's a lot we need to do, and we need reforms.
Sure, and the proper way to look at it is, of course, this state should get an upgrade. With all this manna from heaven floating around, the state's not going to default on its bonds. And remember that's what the credit ratings are really interested in assessing. They tell bond buyers, do you face any default risk on this bond in the near and intermediate term, over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, maybe? No, I don't think Illinois is going to default on their bonds. They have payment priorities and everything else. Some of them are secured by mortgages on assets, but even the unsecured bonds, by statute, are obligated to be paid first. And with this extra money floating around, they are going to be paid first. I would not worry in the near term about Illinois bonds defaulting. And the credit rating agencies properly indicated that. That's good news, as you say. Not terribly important news. It doesn't immediately lower interest costs for the state. The bonds that are outstanding have whatever interest rate is established under them. It will make future borrowings a little cheaper, knocking a little bit off of the interest rate that we have to pay on future bond offerings, but it's really just not that big a deal.
Yeah, and in the end, good for the financial class, but it doesn't do anything for the ordinary Illinoisan who's struggling. So we'll take it for now, but when all this free money runs out, I don't know what the credit rating agencies are thinking, because once that money's gone, we're back to where we were, and I'd argue we're going to be in a worse position because our pension debts are worse, and most of the negatives that have gone on, people leaving, all those things will make it worse. So that's a big deal.
Yeah, well, they have expressly called out this warning that this is a temporary thing because of all this federal money. A guy from Fitch said, "What goes up must come down." What a wonderful quote, and that's exactly right. He was referring to that incoming federal money, and you can't ignore that warning from the rating agencies or anybody else.
Yeah, I might note that we have a graphic in our piece that shows these ratings by from the best rated to the worst rated. I can't ignore the fact that Indiana and Iowa and Missouri are all AAA rated. Those are the best quality states. That means that they're really well run. Interest costs are low, but it also means that they have a good reputation. And so, if you're a manufacturing company looking to invest in a state, you want to expand, you see that AAA rating, you say, hey, I trust that state. They have good governance, they have good numbers, good financials. Then you look at Illinois on the chart and you say, wait a minute, it's close to junk, not well run. A big part of that poor rating is governance. We're a very badly run state, and we can talk about corruption all day. So those are the decision factors that people, companies are making when they look at a state, and this is still something that really hurts us.
That Pritzker has not been terribly good at dealing with criticism, has he? As in past speeches, he used his favorite phrase, carnival barkers, clearly referring to wire points and some of the other fiscal realists out there, like Truth in Accounting, Illinois Policy Institute, and some others. Truth in Accounting, Illinois Policy Institute. And we had this kind of remarkable additional language that he put into it. He said that we are spelunkers looking for misery. We naysayers are spelunkers. When did spelunkers become demonized? That was kind of a strange phrase. But Pritzker's press secretary picked up on that and made a hashtag out of it on Twitter. Spelunkers looking pound, spelunkers is looking for misery to criticize us. And both deputy governors, Andy Manar and Christian Mitchell, thank you, began using the hashtag as well. What an unserious, unprofessional way to deal with legitimate criticisms, legitimate questions that we've raised, documented by facts. But again, he knows he can get away with it because there's a relatively small part of the population that takes the time to look at these things closely. Most people get their news from sound bites off of their evening news show, maybe glancing through the Chicago Tribune, which rarely carries any of this, although they did have a very good editorial about the budget that basically reflected our views about the temporariness of the federal money. But for the most part, people don't know about this. Pritzker knows they don't know about it. And so, again, he'll probably get away with it.
Yeah, I think it's a question of, this separate topic about politics and competitors to Pritzker, and whether those who are running for governor can make such arguments and make them, make them well and get them heard. So that'll be a bigger part of the discussion over the next few months as we head toward the election. Mark, just one thing that I think we should definitely end with is a little bit of assessment. The numbers are so good, as we talked about, that he's also offered $1 billion in relief, property tax relief, sales tax relief, gas tax relief. How do you appraise that?
Well, on that, I think the general public largely kind of recognize that as an election year gimmick. It has three parts to it. A 2-cent reduction per gallon in the gasoline tax. That's really to offset what was going to be an automatic increase based on inflation. Ted, you have a full article up about that. And interestingly, he's opposed on that by many unions and other ordinary allies of his. The reason being that all that tax revenue is dedicated under a constitutional amendment that was passed a couple of years ago to road construction and such. So the trade unions, the construction trades and such, see that as their own little pot of money that they want to protect. And we should keep in mind here too that this is just Pritzker's proposal. The budget won't be finalized until 12 or 24 hours before the end of the session, as it always is. And 1,000 pages will pop up that most people don't read, and we'll figure out what's in it afterwards. So this may be negotiated away. The other two elements are a slight reduction in the sales tax on groceries. Obviously very popular right now. I'm not sure it's necessary. And thirdly, a rebate of property taxes, which would go conceivably up to $300 per taxpayer, and it's adjusted based on your income. I have some questions about the constitutionality of that. That's a backdoor progressive income tax, essentially. I don't know that anybody would challenge it, but Pritzker clearly did what's politically popular. If you pick the three things that most rankle consumers right now, it's those. It's spiking grocery prices, gasoline taxes, which they notoriously hate, and property taxes. And they do fall on the poor and working class the hardest. So it is an election year stunt. We'll see if it survives. We'll see if people see through it.
Yeah, and it's a little deeper than that too, in that it's certainly a stunt. But as you mentioned, the gas tax is not a reduction in what they're paying today. It's a not increasing them in July of 2022 when they're expected to go up a little over 2 cents. So, and of course that's after a doubling of the gas tax by Governor Pritzker in his capital plan. And we're one of the only 4 states in the country to have a sales tax on our gasoline. So as inflation has kicked in and pushed up gas prices by 50% in the last year, then the sales taxes that Illinois have to pay on gasoline have gone up as well. So we have the second highest gas taxes in the country. Illinois say, I don't want the 2 cent. Don't give me a 2 cent thing. I want real reform. And a similar story on the property taxes, because with inflation, most states have most counties and governments have a rule that says that property tax levies can go up by as much as 5% based on inflation. So they're all going to go up 5%. So the relief is giving is not relief. It's just not increasing things. So both not very good things, and they're certainly not structural and not fair to the Illinois that are paying the second highest property taxes in the country.
Yeah, it's important to recognize what Pritzker has actually done with taxes. Remember, in 2019, he passed a long list of very regressive taxes that fall primarily on the poor and working class hardest. That increase in the gasoline tax eliminated a sales tax, or reduced the sales tax exemption for trading automobiles. Very stiff increases in vehicle registration costs. Those things really hit lower-end consumers very hard. And then we had the fair tax proposal in the last election round, which would have amended the Constitution to allow for a progressive income tax. And remember all the doom and gloom that we heard from him and his administration about what would happen if that wouldn't have passed, and would have provided for an automatic $3 billion per year increase in taxes on higher income earners and no material reduction for lower income earners. Well, they said if this doesn't pass, we'll have to raise the income tax across the board by 20%. That's what Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton said. Well, it didn't pass. The public saw through that, fortunately, to their credit. But now Pritzker's bragging that everything is great and we're on the road to recovery. Had he gotten that tax, it would have been spent on things that would have made no difference in Illinois, just like so much else that Illinois gets and spends.
I think what's fascinating, and it's this: he was able to turn around Illinois in the deepest recession, with lockdowns that he's pushed. He's able to do that without, a massive tax hike. He says, he did it all himself, and yet then the question is why did he want a progressive tax? A couple of years ago, if he can do it without a progressive tax, he should have just done it then. So anyway, I'm being facetious. Look, I think, we're beating up on Pritzker, and I think rightfully so. I think what Illinois really should have heard, and he could be positive about some of the things, but the honest assessment would have told Illinoisans that, hey, let's thank this massive inflow of COVID aid for temporarily hiding our big problems. But the reality is that Illinois still has the worst pension crisis in the country. The reality is we're one of 3 states to shrink in the last decade. The reality is that we still have the second highest property taxes, and that we're only 2 notches away from a junk rating. The honest assessment would have said, hey, Illinoisans, get ready. We're going to have to pass these massive reforms to fix our state and make it be the great state that it should be. But, we didn't get any of that. We just got a lot of cheering. Things are good. And, hey, basically saying, hey, elect me. I'll be running for election in November. So remember all these good things and all this spending I'm doing.
Yeah, as a political matter, I just don't get it why he wouldn't see that he'd be better off being a truth teller, if just level with the public, tell them what our problems are, tell them how we're trying to address it. He hasn't done that. Rauner started off that way. He catapulted, from 0 name recognition to win the Republican nomination, initially doing just that. He backed off, later on, and it became a disaster after he got the nomination. But that works, and I just don't get it as a political matter why candidates wouldn't do that. We'll see if the competitors he has in the race for governor do it. We'll be watching them, and let's hope we get some serious truth-telling out of it.
Yeah, Mark, I think it'd be nice to have some principled leaders for once, and who are truth tellers, but we don't have that. And I think that's what we'll have to hope for. And as you say, I think we'll have to look at the candidates, and we'll be reporting on that soon. So that's all I've got on the budget, Mark. You got anything else?
Sadly, that's all I got too. I wish I could come up with something more positive to say, but we're going to keep calling out the whoppers that we see, whether from Pritzker, his Republican opponents, or anybody else. It's a lot of work, but we're going to stay on top of it.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for joining the dialogue at Wire Points. Talk to you soon.